So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a Brilliant Business podcast. My name is Nick Bryant, and I'm here with Pam Loch from the Loch Associates group. Hey, Pam.
Hi there.
Good to see you again. Thanks for asking me in.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to talk about a couple of topics, Workers' Protection Bill, toxic cultures, and also strikes and industrial action. Now, I think I'm right in saying that you were interviewed by The Telegraph recently about toxic cultures regarding the Workers' Protection Bill. So tell us what it is and how it affects employers.
Well, one of the issues that we're coming across increasingly is, I suppose, staff that are unhappy about the environments they're working in. And in the past, I suppose pre-#MeToo, staff would not raise issues in the same way because they were fearful of losing their job or facing recrimination, some sort of negative action being taken against them. And so what you end up happening is you end up with perhaps having somebody who is at the top of a business who has created a culture that's become quite toxic because people live in fear. So they're not prepared to report. What ends up happening is you have an environment that people are unhappy working in. So clearly if they're unhappy, they're going to be demotivated. Productivity is going to drop off. But actually what also happens is you lose your best staff. Yeah. Now, clearly that's not what you want as a business. But quite often, you might be unaware that this is going on in your business because obviously nobody's spoken up. Yeah. So what you have is this horrible toxic culture that's developed. And we're now noticing that there's been a shift, especially since #MeToo, because people are feeling more empowered to complain. Yeah. There's less stigma attached to using grievances. So there's an increasing number of people using grievances as a way to try and resolve issues or a way to bring issues to the forefront. And obviously that's quite costly to deal with and takes up management time. So, what we're encouraging, clients to do is to try and identify if they've got an issue in their business, put in place mechanisms to try and deal with it. Okay. And also, make sure they take any issues seriously because, otherwise they're exposed to quite expensive potential litigation that can ensue. So if someone's unhappy, even if they're still in a job, they can bring a discrimination claim. Okay. Or they can bring other claims for the way they've been treated, especially if they've left because they felt they couldn't, work there anymore. Okay. So we have noticed, obviously, a change and an increase in complaints that are coming through, but equally, employers are now, particularly our HR consultants, are trying to help our clients retain staff because it's still such a tough market to recruit good people. Of course, yeah. So there's benefits both ways, trying to prevent litigation and issues that can be quite costly, but also trying to create an environment where people want to come and work for you or stay working for you. Yeah. So I think it's important that you identify there's an issue. And the first thing you can do is do an audit, do a staff engagement survey. Okay. Make sure that you take action after that. Because there's no point in doing an anonymous survey to find out if there's issues or things that could improve and then not doing anything about it. Because, we have individuals that will come to us and say, look, I've got this issue, and actually they've never done anything about it. Right. So make sure you action it. Other things you can do is make sure you're putting in place training. And we're doing quite a lot of training with clients to try and prevent harassment and bullying. Also train managers to spot signs within the organisation and also alert managers to treatment that would be unlawful and unfair so that they can make sure that that's not happening in their business. Okay. Now what the government is doing is the government is also recognising that there's still issues with people, and in particular women, who feel unable to complain and are operating in these sort of toxic environments. And it originally started as a private member's bill, but it's now government sponsored. And so the Workers' Protection Bill is a piece of legislation that's currently working its way through Parliament. And if it becomes law, it will come into force next year. Right. And employers will be obliged to ensure that they've taken all reasonable steps to prevent harassment, and in particular sexual harassment. Okay. Now that's quite onerous because that means that as an employer, you've got to basically make an assessment before any potential harassment takes place to identify any risk areas. Yeah. And that's not just in your workplace, that's looking at suppliers because, as I said, it's third-party harassment as well. Now, I don't know, you might remember back in 2008, Between 2008 and 2013, we had a similar piece of legislation. It wasn't quite so onerous. It was called a sort of 3 strikes and you're out.
Okay.
And so it gave the employers a couple of goes to get it right. But if somebody had been harassed by a third party and complained to their employer about it, the employer was expected to take steps to address it. And they had 2 shots at that. And on the third one, they would be found to be liable. Okay. That was repealed in 2013 because they thought it was unreasonable. Roll forward 10 years, and we're now in a different environment. We've had #MeToo. We've had a lot of changes, in the working environment. And we've now got this new piece of legislation, which if it goes through unamended, will make it far more onerous on employers. But obviously there's a positive side to this, because obviously they're trying to address issues before they occur. So they're trying to prevent harassment rather than dealing with it afterwards. They're trying to prevent it in the first place.
Just rewind a little bit. You mentioned #MeToo a few times.
Yeah.
Just to people that don't know what that means, tell us a bit what that means. So what that was.
That really arose around Harvey Weinstein and his the allegations that he was subjecting women to sexual crimes of various natures. And what followed on from there was an attempt to bring attention to the fact that some women were being subjected to harassment unlawfully and were being forced to do things. In that instance, it was in respect of the film industry and people's careers were being affected if they didn't agree or didn't end up participating in activities that were effectively sort of forced on them. Now there's been some various trials since then.
With Donald Trump this morning, actually.
Indeed. So we have got, and in his case it's quite interesting because it's a civil court, and obviously not the same as a criminal court. But civil court action, obviously, where he's been found guilty by the jury. And obviously, in this instance, it's not a prison sentence, but it's a substantial penalty.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's a similar thing, in the tribunal system or indeed in the civil courts here. I think there is a possibility that's, as I said, there's been an increasing number of claims that we've noticed and complaints that are coming through.
Yeah.
But yes, #MeToo was a campaign to try and draw attention to this and actually try and stop that sort of activity taking place.
Is there things that it's going to tighten everything up, isn't it? I presume for third parties, for employers, and for staff. But is there things that employers shouldn't ask staff? And are they allowed to ask them about their marital status, their personal life, or is that classed as toxic or the wrong thing to ask? There are obviously there's legislation in place to prevent unlawful discrimination. So discrimination means treating somebody less favourably than you treat somebody else, essentially. Yeah. And then you've got what we call 9 protected characteristics in the UK. Okay. So one of those is gender. So whether somebody at the moment is a man or a woman. Yeah. You've also got protection in respect of your marital status as well. Yeah. So if you think you've been less favourably treated because you're married on a civil partnership, then there's also scope for bringing claims for unlawful discrimination on those grounds. Okay. So when you are interviewing someone, you need to be very careful to ensure that you're consistent in your approach, and that you've thought through why you're asking that question. Yeah. And we would always recommend that you have a standard list of questions that you ask everybody, and that you don't ask questions with what would be the purpose, I suppose, in asking somebody, are you married or in a civil partnership? So unless you have a good reason for asking something and you can justify it, I would say don't ask it. Sometimes people in interviews will talk to you and explain, the situation you're in because they're just talking generally, and that's fine. You gather that information; it's part of the interview process. But I think you need to think very carefully about what you're asking somebody and make sure that you consistently take the same approach with everyone. Okay. And it's the same with, we have clients that check on social media to see what people are doing before they take them on. So is that allowed?
Well, I would always, as part of the interview process, make somebody aware that is part of your process, that you actually carry out social media checks. Okay. Now somebody might turn around and say, but that means they can delete things they don't want you to see. Well, that's fine. But equally, again, you've got to be careful and make sure you do the same. And there used to be an argument that, and this has gone back a few years when first, social media first came out, that older people didn't use social media platforms in the same volume and in the same way as younger people.
Yeah.
And I think that argument has probably diminished somewhat, and I've not seen it getting put forward. But I think I would say make sure that you alert somebody that's what you're going to do, and also then make sure you do it for everybody and not just select few.
Yeah. Sort of across the board. And what about afterwards, once they're employed and someone's, they've been out and done something silly at the weekend and put it on Facebook, is that the same thing?
Well, that depends.
Okay.
Now,
right.
we've had a few cases over the years.
Yeah.
It really comes down to, first of all, yes, that's your private life. As long as you haven't sort of publicly put out there that, for example, you do something with a banner for your company behind it and you do something inappropriate, then that could bring the business into disrepute. So you'll often find in contracts of employment there is a clause that says, we have in our contracts, for example, you're to act as an ambassador for the business at all times, and we encourage our clients to have that. But equally, there is a division, between private life and work. But if it starts going over the line and there's a bit of blur in there, so that you start, if you do something that could impact, on the company's reputation, then the company would be legitimately entitled to take disciplinary action against you. So you still see some issues involving somebody's, their activities outside work, overstepping the mark and actually then becoming something that's affected their job.
I guess every situation has to be monitored differently. But
it does. It does. It really does. So I've been doing this now for over 25 years. There's never two cases that are the same. They're always different, but there are some similarities. But we've got to look at each case on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
And, for employers, it's important they also make clear what conduct what's accepted and what's not accepted.
Yeah.
So, it's important that you've got a social media policy that sets out, what effectively sets out what would overstep the mark in terms of comments that are getting put on social media.
Okay.
But we've come across situations where employees have put up negative comments about their employer on Facebook.
Oh.
That's not a good move I would say, but it does happen. It does happen.
Yeah.
And so it's important to make sure that everybody knows what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and again, sometimes it's more than just having a policy. It's putting in place training, make sure people understand, looking at your induction and onboarding processes, making sure people realise that sort of conduct's not acceptable.
Okay. Well, that answers that question. Let's move on to the other topic that we're going to talk about was strikes and industrial action. We talked earlier about particularly the teacher strikes and maybe taking a legal perspective on it with the teachers' bursaries and recruitment, etc. You can talk to us about that.
Well, it's quite a challenging sector at the moment for teaching, I think, because there's a huge shortage in certain areas. So what the government has tried to do is try to address that, and what they've introduced are these teachers' bursaries. Now, we have had some bursaries in the past, but the new ones that they're introducing this year, they're quite significant in the sums that could be paid. And there are a much more extensive number of subjects that they're covering, so it goes beyond maths and chemistry and touches on other subjects. Now, I think it's a good thing to do. I think what might surprise some people is the bursaries are up to £27,000 tax free.
Okay.
The person doesn't have to stay beyond a certain point. Once they've completed they don't even have to stay in teaching. And, I think possibly quite a lot of people are not aware of the availability of this. But, if it encourages more people to come into teaching, great. And, of course, the challenge we've got the teachers striking as well because they're unhappy about various things, conditions of working, etc. So, you've got the government on the one hand trying to do one thing to encourage people into teaching, and then you've got these activities which are not really encouraging people, I would have thought, to join the teaching profession. Having said that, there's been a significant increase in the number of people applying to become teachers.
Okay.
So it's going to be interesting to see how this works out. But more generally on the strike front, again, there's new legislation that's currently working its way through Parliament, and it's just gone through the House of Lords, and there's been some amendments made by the House of Lords. Now, this legislation, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill, 2023. And basically the government is trying to put in place a requirement to have a minimum number of people remaining at work, so that you can't effectively have a situation where all the nurses went on strike and a hospital was left without appropriate support.
Okay.
So that it's what it says on the label. They're trying to put in place minimum levels, so that if they can sort of prevent, as I say, a situation where the public are being severely affected as a result of a decision to strike. Now, the strike laws, the laws that govern the striking are quite rigorous already.
Are they?
So there's quite. I mean, you might have read recently about the Secretary of State for Health challenging the nurses' strike because it was unlawful, and that it is quite challenging to actually bring somebody out on strike in the first place, because the boxes you've got to tick, the process you've got to go through. So this is also then something else that the unions are going to have to contend with if it becomes law. But currently the House of Lords, they've made some amendments to it, and they're trying to stop the legislation going through where it would enable an employer to basically dismiss somebody if they didn't comply with the requirements and actually continue to work, even if they voted to strike and the strike had gone through as being legitimate. So it's going to be interesting at times to see where it goes to. But it's going to cover health, transport, education, fire and rescue, and border control, as well as nuclear decommissioning. So as you can see, it's designed for very specific public services, but it's quite wide in its application at the moment. So it's going to be interesting to see where it ends up once it gets back to the House, the House of Commons. Yeah,
that's an interesting topic with lots of sort of, it could go that way, it could go that way, where people are, people are wanting to work. Nurses are wanting to work, for instance. They're not getting paid enough, so they strike, and then they could lose their jobs because they striked. There's lots of ins and outs on that. I'm sure there's. What was it called again? What was the mouth?
Strikes Minimum Service Levels Bill 2023.
Right. Okay. So watch out for that. Well, thanks, Pam. That's great. All that information about those. If anyone wants any help with those, I guess to get in touch with you, because you know all about that, and all the details for Pam, as we said, are on the Brilliant Businesses website, and I'm sure or her team would like to help you if they can. So thanks again, Pam. Thank you. Good to see you, and we'll see you for another podcast soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.